Awesome. Thank you, Alyssa. Good morning, everyone. If this is your first time ever meeting me, I'm Leah Mforney. I am the Underserved Populations Policy Advocate and Training Assistant here at MCASA. My pronouns are she, her, and hers, and I will be training you guys on how to serve sexual assault survivors from underserved populations. So this training, we're going to do a quick overview of what underserved populations are, talking about a little bit about identity, oppression, trauma. I'll touch a little bit about barriers to access, and then we'll discuss some things about moving forward, talk about the socio-ecological model, as well as what equity really means. So who is the underserved and why? So what do we mean when we are discussing underserved populations? As we know, all sexual assault survivors are underserved, right? Sexual violence is 100% preventable, yet it still happens every single day to people of all identities and all backgrounds. All sexual abuse survivors experience barriers to justice and healing that they deserve. And so today, we're going to talk about the survivors who may face additional barriers and traumas solely because of their intersecting identities. These survivors may be underserved by our organizations because of our cultural attitudes and beliefs about their identity, our individual lack of awareness and understanding of their identity, and systematic oppression of people who hold that identity. So the first thing I want to talk about is identity. Now, this is not an exhaustive list, but we do have several social identity groups. And so I want to briefly go through each of these categories and provide some examples where necessary. So the first group is age, right? Age is also one aspect of our identity, right? When we talk to, young folks, younger, older folks, right? Age is where cultural views and the way we treat people vary, right? So in some European cultures, however, like elderly people are highly respected. Asian cultures, elderly people are highly respected. There are cases where you might see that younger generations live separately from those that are older than them. So, for example, in Asian cultures, we tend to see that getting old is a positive thing, right? Elderly people are respected and they are cared for by their children. Another identity is race. So, race is a socially construct category, right? It's typically based on skin color. So, we're talking about Black, brown, white, mixed race, biracial, multiracial, right? Then we have ethnicity. So ethnicity is where we dive into cultural, shared heritage, and language. So that's where we get into titles like Latinx, Pacific Islander, Afro-Caribbean, European American, right? They're not necessarily tied to race. They're not necessarily tied to geographic location, but they mostly focus on culture. And then we have national origin. So national origin is where we get into the geographical aspect of our identity. So Australian, German, Bolivian, Japanese, for example. Skin color is another identity. So that's when we start to look at things like light skin, dark skin, brown. Skin color is oftentimes intersected with race, right? So that's when we start to see that someone can be Asian and be light skinned, right? Or someone can be albino, or there are variations of people of color. That's all skin color. Then we have disability. And so disability is an identity and it encompasses things like mental illness, physical disability, cognitive disability. Another identity that we have is deaf and hard of hearing. So this can be seen as a disability, but often it is not. Okay. Another identity that many of us can relate to is faith, religion, and spirituality, right? That is an identity by itself. And then we have gender identity and gender expression. So the gender someone identifies with, right, not necessarily the gender that they were assigned at birth, is an identity. So we're looking at man, woman, cisgender, transgender, gender nonconforming, non-binary, gender queer, how they express their gender is also what we look at with this identity. So is it feminine? Is it masculine? Right? That's what we look at. And then you have sexual or romantic orientation. Now, this is defined by gender or genders that a person is sexually or romantically attracted to. So, this is where we start to get into the identity of like lesbian, bisexual, gay, asexual, aromantic, biromantic, queer, as some examples. And then you have socioeconomic status and class, right? Which is what most we know as like the middle class, upper class, right? Then you have tribal or an indigenous affiliation as a form of an identity. We also have first language, meaning the language that someone learns to speak first. Immigration status, so that's a form of an identity, whether they're a citizen, temporary or permanent resident, if they're a refugee, if they're unauthorized or undocumented. And then the last type of identity that we tend to see is body size, right? So weight discrimination is important to include because it's often ignored, is an often ignored type of prejudice for individuals that are in marginalized communities. Intersectionality. So it is important to note that no one group is the same, right? No one holds the same type of identity. And so some of you may be familiar with the term intersectionality. And if not, I'm going to share a little bit of information about it. So Kimberly Crenshaw, a lawyer and a professor at UCLA School of Law and Columbia Law School, coined the term intersectionality in 1989 to describe the intersection of identities and power. So, for example, she discusses how a Black man can experience discrimination because he's Black. A white woman can experience discrimination because she's a woman. A Black woman, however, can experience a different type of discrimination because she's both a woman and Black. The way her intersecting identities are treated gives her a very different life experience than someone who does not experience both of those forms of discrimination at once. So, an organization that has discriminatory hiring practice can hire a white woman and hire a Black man and say, we're not racist or we're not sexist. But if they refuse to hire a Black woman, they're being discriminatory in a way that is easier for them to excuse. That intersection of our identities and the power associated with those identities impact how we see the world and how the world sees us and how we're treated. We also know that there are populations that are underserved, not because of identity, but because of circumstance, right? So some of those populations might be homeless people or those that are incarcerated. So what I want you to remember about intersectionality is that someone from an underserved population is someone who holds one or many identities that have been historically and or currently oppressed. So let's talk about oppression. What do I mean when I say they've been oppressed, or what is oppression? One of the best definitions that I have heard is that oppression is a perpetual state of disadvantage. It is not something where one can just pull themselves up by the bootstraps and get out, right? Oppression is oftentimes historic, systemic, right? It is ingrained in our cultural beliefs. It is ingrained in our attitudes, our behaviors, and is often traumatic for those experiencing it. And so we'll talk a little bit about trauma in a few. But one of the most important connections I want you to make here is that oppression operates via a system of power. People who hold one or many dominant identities are given unearned power in society. People who hold one or more marginalized identities are rendered powerless. This is how hierarchies work. So one group has power and the other one is rendered powerless. This is so important to talk about when we are talking about anti-sexual violence work because power operates the same way here. When one is victimized by sexual violence, their power is taken from them, while the person who harmed them is seeking to gain power over them. Sexual violence is a power-based violence and power-based attack, just as racism is, sexism is, anti-LGBTQ, antagonism, and ableism, right? They're all forms of power-based violence. This violence is used to perpetuate oppression of targeted groups, right? So we know that anyone can identify, we know that anyone of any identity can be victimized by sexual violence. But we also know that victims who are already hold a marginalized identity and are deemed powerless by society are at higher risk at being targeted. So we're looking at people with mental illness, people who are transgender, who are homeless, indigenous people, children, all experience extremely high rates of sexual violence. This is why we advocate for anti-oppression work. We cannot eliminate sexual violence when it is most often used historically and still today as a tool of social control, physical domination, and power to sustain oppression of marginalized groups and to maintain power for the abuser. In order to get to the root of sexual violence, we have to advocate for an equal and equitable society where power is shared. Part of that journey is eliminating our own personal biases, expanding our personal and professional networks, improving access to our institutions for marginalized people, and enhancing support of marginalized people within our institutions. So this is an example of the rape culture pyramid that the Virginia Sexual Assault and Domestic Violence Action Alliance created. And so I feel like this is such a wonderfully done visual representation of the way in which oppression is the foundation of sexual violence. And so the structural forms of oppression cultivate a society which the attitudes, the behaviors, and policies higher up on the pyramid become prevalent and pervasive. So you can see the terms at the bottom are forming blocks that create additional harmful behaviors and attitudes towards minority, right, and marginalized people, right? So if you look down at the bottom of this pyramid, this is how we then turn around and have things that become a little more invasive. So then the privilege conversation, rape jokes, slut shaming, victim blaming, all of it starts from where we are in the pyramid, right? So when it comes to sexual violence, prevention cannot be successful without addressing structural oppression. And we also have to consider the roots of structural oppression in our work when we are doing direct service with survivors and navigating systems to support them. So now let's talk a little bit about trauma. What is trauma? So trauma is an emotional and physical harm resulting from violence, conflict, natural disasters, or societal structures. One thing I want to point out is that trauma is a normal response to an abnormal experience. Each survivor reacts to trauma in their own way. So some signs can be experiencing flashbacks, triggers, other symptoms of PTSD, substance abuse, depression, anxiety, numbness or disassociation, avoidance, hyperarousal, impacted sense of identity, eating disorders, sleep disorders, self-harm, and suicidal ideations or attempts. Note that there are several types of traumas. And so for the sake of this training, I will not be able to go through all of them, but I do want to highlight specifically for them, and that is collective trauma, historical trauma, cultural trauma, and structurally induced trauma, so that you'll be able to notice how they intersect with each other. So collective trauma. Collective trauma is trauma that impacts individuals and groups, right? So we have examples of like colonization, gender-based violence, COVID, right? That was a form of collective trauma, police brutality, institutionalized racism. Historical trauma, that is a cumulative emotional and psychological wounding over the lifespan or across generations, right? So we're looking at things like slavery, genocide, environmental uh, degradation, transgenerational trauma, right, is studies that found that trauma that can be inherited, right? So traumas that is kind of passed down from one generation after another after another. So an example of that could be a complex post-traumatic stress disorder or anxiety, right? So for example, people who are descendant of Holocaust survivors, we have found have elevated heart rates, right? Then you have cultural trauma. So this is trauma that can occur when attempts are made to eradicate a part of or all of a culture or people. So a good example of that is Holocaust, right? Or the treatment of indigenous people, or homophobia or transphobia, right? Those are all examples of cultural trauma. And then the last type of trauma is structurally induced trauma. So this is trauma created by policies that result in unjust, abusive, racist, homophobic, or unsafe systems that cause hardship, often on a long-term continuous basis. So a lot of those examples is our prison system, right? The US policy abroad system, capitalism, poverty, right? The welfare system, our mental health system, our public school system, you know, classism, churches, criminal justice system, all of those are examples of structurally induced trauma. Note that these traumas are important to keep in mind because an individual that survives a sexual, when an individual who survives sexual assault, they may deal with trauma after the event. However, if they are marginalized identity, they may be already living with cultural trauma or transgenerational trauma that isn't related to the assault. These compound traumas will impact their ability to seek help, to navigate support systems, and their ability to heal from what has happened to them. All right, let's talk a little bit about the potential barriers to accessing accessing support services. So again, everyone experience with abuse is different. Their trauma response is different, and how they move through the world with many identities is going to be different. But there are many barriers that may prevent someone with a marginalized identity from seeking help after an assault, as well as barriers after reporting, right? That may prohibit them from having their experience validated and addressed as effectively as possible. A lot of those barriers are ones that we all know and have heard or maybe even experienced. So some of those barriers are like victim blaming, shame, embarrassment, fear that they will not be believed, not wanting to think about the harm they experience, wanting to avoid traumatization that occur by getting involved in the criminal justice process, being connected to the perpetrator, or fear of what they will do to them. But I want you to start to think about some specific barriers that you may have experienced in your organizations and how they are impacting people with intersect marginalized identities. And so for about 5 minutes, I want you all to just think about some barriers that may prevent a survivor with a marginalized identity from seeking services. And you can drop some of those barriers in the chat. Mm. So someone says stigma against mental health treatment. Yeah, that's a big one. Service providers may come from groups which historically oppressed them. Absolutely. Finance. Yep. Access to transportation, language barrier, Hypersexualization of women of color, distance, yep. Negative past experiences, language barrier. These are all amazing barriers. And these are all of the barriers that our marginalized communities are faced with. Shame. Any others? Someone being biased. Yep. Oh, yeah. Someone being judged. Absolutely. Fear of getting reprisal, negative previous experiences, fear of being judged, not being control, lack of access, victim blaming, absolutely. Afraid to die. All of these are great examples of barriers. So again, let's talk a little bit about these barriers to accessing services. Again, this is not an exhaustive list, right? But these are some of the barriers in addition to the ones we see on the screen that others may be experiencing. So don't want to come out or be outed. So those that are in the LGBTQ IA population, that's one of their fears, right? Of being outed. If for men who might struggle with internalized homophobia, right? There's a fear around if people think they're gay if they were abused by a man. Then if you're a religious or a cultural person, you may not want others to know that you were even engaging in sex, right? Internalized depression. So that's a barrier. Then we have the fear that that you won't be believed, right? So people with mental illness oftentimes feel like that, right? Because they're being told that they're crazy, or someone with a disability, right, might be told that that didn't happen to them, right? Or they may be judged because they didn't fight back or they didn't run in the midst of the situation, right? Or there is the fear of being re-traumatized, right? So if I report and I actually go through this process, right, am I not only going to be believed, but am I going to be re-traumatized by going through this process? Then we have the barrier of the relationship with the offender, right? So someone that may report being sexually assaulted, it might be the person that they're either their caregiver, if they're chronically ill or a person with disability, it might be their children's father or mother, right? If they're an immigrant, there's that fear that they might have to be deported, right? And that the abuser gets to keep their children. So if there's an economic fear there, um, then you also have the fear that if you're a person who may use ASL or ESL, right, that the abuser is going to have to be the one to translate and communicate for them, right? Um, and then there's safety. There's a safety fear, right? Like, how am I going to be safe? Am I going to end up homeless, right? If I report, some other barriers is the fear of the family's response, right? So what's going to happen after they report? If they are low income, is it going to be that the family stops supporting them financially, right? Um, are they going to be disowned? Are they going to be betrayed by their community, right? These are some real fears, right? Are they going to lose their sense of community? If the abuser is actually a family member, right? Like, how is the family going to respond to knowing that, you know, Uncle so and so or Auntie so and so did something, right? We see that's a lot, especially in communities of color, right? Where, if they're abused by their uncle or their aunt or someone, there's this fear of like, I can't tell nobody because nobody's going to believe that, right? And then we have the shame associated with the as a barrier, right? That it becomes too taboo to start talking about intimate experiences or sexual violence. There's a fear around job loss. If I report this, right, especially in cases where our immigrants and our undocumented, if I report that I was sexually assaulted on my job, do I now lose my job? All right. And then we have the fear of how they're going to be received, right, or perceived, right? So For our Black women, oftentimes it's now we're hypersexualized, right? Or we're believed to be promiscuous, like we caused this, right? For our trans people, they might be seen as undesirable. And why would someone want to have sex with them, right? For those Black and Latinx women who may be dark-skinned women, right? We might be perceived as, being aggressive, or we're the aggressor, or we did something to cause this violence, right? And for our men, it might be that they're perceived as strong and there's no way you can be a victim, right? So people in marginalized identities may not want their communities to look bad. And if their abuser is the same race, right, or comes from the same country or the same sexual orientation, there is a fear of betraying their community if they speak up. Not to mention some other barriers like lack of trust in the system. Even if I do report, are you going to actually do what the system is set out to do? Are you going to actually follow through? Right. So then we have the fear of police brutality, or the fear of violence, or the fear of, am I going to be the one to blame? So am I facing incarceration? Right. And so all of these are some fears that keep people, or barriers that keep people from accessing services. One thing I'll share, I recently went to NSAC, which is the National Sexual Assault Conference in San Francisco. And in this same conversation, one of the things that we talked about was not just the accessing of services, but accepting of services, right? Oftentimes we forget that these same barriers keep marginalized communities from accepting services, right? Not so much accessing them, but accepting them, accepting the help, accepting the support, right? And so as service providers, we always want to make sure that we're doing our part to not only make sure that these services are accessible, but that we are being mindful that the bigger barrier might be, I don't trust, right? And so because I don't trust, or I feel like you're not going to understand me, or I feel like you're not going to be culturally competent, or you're not going to affirm me, then I can't accept these services. So let's talk a little bit about moving forward, right? We know what the old way is, but how do we begin to create a new way, right? So keep in mind that even though these are not barriers that people would face at your organization, if they are perceived as a barrier, people from marginalized communities will not seek help, right? So we want to start to ask ourselves, how can we actively assure that people know that you are there to help? And so this is our socio-ecological model. It is the way of looking at all levels of influence. So we have individual influence, interpersonal influence, organizational, community, and then public policy, right? So discrimination, oppression, and microaggressions are experienced on all levels of this model. As you reflect on making your work more inclusive to people of all identities, consider each level of the model. Many times we get stuck in the individual, perhaps even the interpersonal levels, but in order to work to make structural change to systematic oppression, we have to look beyond those first two levels to consider changes that can be made on all levels, right? So for individual level, right, we want to pay attention to our knowledge, our attitudes, and our skills. So some of the things we want to do is make sure that we are avoiding assumptions, right? We don't want to assume someone's orientation. We want to be aware of our own implicit bias, right? We don't want to assume that someone belongs a part of a certain community, right? Another thing that we want to be mindful of when it comes to individuals is that we want to make sure that we are focusing on the trauma, not the identity. All right. So we definitely also want to make sure that we are validating their identities, right? So we want to This is one of the reasons why we want to ask what their pronouns are, how do they identify, right? We want to make sure that we let them know that this is a safe space so that they can be who they are. The other thing from an individual standpoint is that you don't want to ask personal questions unless it is necessary, right? So we want to avoid asking personal questions, right? Unless it's going to be pertinent to what we need to know. The other thing is you want to ask what information is okay to share with other parties, right? When someone comes through your doors to your agency, right, and they start working with you want to be transparent. You want to ask them, hey, is it okay that I share this information with another member of our team, right? And explain why you might need to share this information. The other thing is we got to be mindful of language. So we want to start using simple language when we're working with survivors from marginalized communities. Oftentimes, because we've been doing this work for so long, we tend to use industry words, industry jargon, and they have no clue what we're talking about. So be mindful of that and be okay with just using simple terms when talking with them and addressing them, okay? And then we want to make sure that we understand that when the survivor's response might be different from your own, right? Oftentimes in the work that we do, because we genuinely want to help, right? It can be frustrating when you're providing so much information or resources, and it seems like that particular survivor is just not interested, right? It can feel frustrating. So you want to make sure that you're paying attention to, is this your frustration or their frustration? You want to make sure that you're separating your feelings from their feelings in the work that we do. Because remember, trauma looks different for everyone, and their response is going to be different for everyone. On an interpersonal level, this is getting into our social network. So we want to pay attention to things that we are reading, that we're watching. We want to make sure that we're listening to marginalized voices. We want to get involved in our communities, on our campuses. Go to these campus events, go to community events outside of your campus, right? Social media is an amazing tool to really hear narratives from marginalized populations, right, that you might not get from the mainstream media, right? So you want to make sure that you're putting yourself in a position to learn more about the communities that you're serving. From an organizational standpoint, we're looking at the environment, right? Our social institutions. So do you have ways of communicating with anyone that comes in, right? So for those who might have language barriers, do you have interpreters, right? Or resources for people who speak various languages? Or do you have ASL available? If someone wants to come through your doors and they need ASL, do you have that? Or Braille, right? Do you have those things in place at your organization? Are you gathering data about the people you are serving, right? So are you taking the time to survey your community and really get information directly from them about what it is they need? You know, how more can we help? And then are you paying attention to who you're hiring, right? We've talked about one of those barriers previously being that someone that doesn't look like me may not understand me, right? So are we paying attention, you know, if you're a part of the hiring team, are you paying attention to who you're hiring? Also, from an organizational standpoint, are you looking at your paperwork? Right? Are we making sure that our paperwork and our forms are updated? Are we making sure that we're putting the pronouns as options on our paperwork so that we don't risk misgendering someone if they come into our office? And also, are we being clear about the limitations in your organization? So are you telling people up front what it is that you can and cannot do, right? And then also, are you looking at your policies? Are you making sure that you are creating a organization of inclusion, right? From training your staff to who you're hiring and the policies that you put in place, right? And then has your organizational statement become inclusive, right? Are you making sure that the statements that you're using, your mission, your vision, all of it is inclusive? And then Looking at your policies. Are you making sure that your policies and your procedures name different identities? This is definitely very important. And then the last part from an organizational standpoint is your physical space. So are you making sure that the physical space, your physical office, is accessible for people with disabilities or people with sensory issues, right? Or people who have autoimmune diseases or other illnesses. And then website, is it a universal design, right? Are we making sure that our colors contrast, that the screen is readable, that it's large print when we're posting like our phone numbers and our contact, it's user friendly, right? So it can be accessible from phone or computer, right? Because we want to make sure that all of these things are helping with addressing the barriers for those in marginalized communities. And then do you have text options or TTY for your hotlines, right? So TTY is that special device that lets people who are deaf, hard of hearing, or even speech impaired use the telephone to communicate, right? So do we have those things for our hotline? From a community standpoint, we're looking at cultural views, norms, relationships between organizations. So, how is outreach in our organization? Are we reaching out to different communities? Are we collaborating with other organizations, both on campus, off campus? Are we building those relationships? Are we sharing knowledge? Are there transportation options to and from your office? Are they accessible? How are you working with your local officials to really advocate for inclusive laws, right? And then public policy, right? So when we get into public policy of this model, we're looking at our state and local laws and our regulations. So are we voting? Are we being mindful of who we're voting into office, right? Are we working, for those of you that work in college campuses, are you working with student government? Are you building relationships with your senior administrators? So let's talk a little bit about equity. So on all levels, we should be striving for equity, not equality, right? And so this image is showing you the difference between equity and equality. So equality shows four people with the same exact bike, right? They all have the same bike, meaning they're all being treated equally in that they have the same resource, but it is not accommodating to their individual needs. You see one person that is wheelchair bound and the bike is not accessible for their needs. Equity, however, shows the same folks each on different bikes. While they were all not given the same exact resource, they are all able to ride bikes together and get to wherever they need to be in a way that is accessible to them. We have to be mindful that people are not a one size fit all. Okay. And so you may be thinking that we've been doing it this way for years and it seems to work. But who is it working for? Who really has to jump through extra hoops to make it work for them? Sometimes we have to get really creative with our resources and our policies and our paperwork and even our supportive services, our money and our staff in order to ensure that every survivor has what they need to heal from what has already happened to them. We have to think critically and also super proactively. So instead of asking, how do we include this person in our work? We should start asking, why are they not included in the first place? And address the root of those issues and those biases. The more inclusive we can be in our interactions and organizations and legislature, the more people will be able to serve as effectively as possible. Equality is treating others how we want to be treated. Equity is treating others how they want to be treated. And so for the last time, I want us to think about what strategies do you plan to implement after this training today? So you can drop them in the chat. What are some things that you have thought about, that have come to you that you're like, I can add this to what I'm doing and the work that I'm doing to help survivors? Anyone? Okay. Oh, that's a good one. Be mindful that every survivor is different and needs different services and supports. Absolutely. It's not a one size fit all. Any other strategies? Oh, that's a good one. Begin the process of getting TTY for our hotline. Yes. Ensure plans are individualized. Think much more about this about size as a marginalized factor. Yep, it's good. These are good. Trauma looks different in every person and how they deal with it. Absolutely. Again, not a one size fit all. Well, that concludes today's training. Again, my name is Leah M. Forney. I am the Underserved Policy Advocate and Training Specialist here at MCASA. That is my direct phone number. You can also send me an email as leahmforney@mcasa.org if you have any additional questions. And thank you. And I'll turn it back over to you, Alyssa.
Thank you. So I'd like to thank I'd like to thank Leah for the presentation. I also want to make just a small note about tomorrow's presentation. So there's a mistake in the email that I initially sent out. That presentation tomorrow is actually going to be going till 12 p.m. If people can't make it, don't worry, it'll be recorded and I'll be sending out that email. I also just want to add that I just put in the chat the evaluation link. Don't forget that if you want credits for CEUs or a certificate of attendance, go ahead and fill out that link. And if you miss it in the chat, I will be sending that out in the email tomorrow as well. If you have any questions, go ahead and put that in the chat and we'll try and get to them. Thank you for coming.